Another day, another Mass Effect video without any real big news. But I do think we have an interesting topic today. It's going to be talking about Mark Dara. He recently did an interview with a influencer in the gaming space. He also did a Q&A and is actually currently doing a Q&A for hitting 20,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel. Basically with Mass Effect, he had some things to say, some things that have made headlines, some things that haven't, and I just kind of wanted to talk about it. So let's get into it. So the thing that's getting all of the attention is him saying that BioWare kind of soft, proposed a Dragon Age trilogy or Dragon Age Origins and Dragon Age 2 remaster to EA over the years, and EA just wasn't interested. I don't think that's all that interesting. If you look into that situation a little bit, you'll find that those two games were made on a proprietary engine that only those two games ever used, which was, I think it's called the Eclipse engine. And so you would have to make the games from scratch, or you would have to import those games into an engine that could accept as much as possible and then rejigger it to work and all that. I think in the post Veilguard world, or at least for the time being, you aren't going to see EA being like, yeah, sure, make those old games from scratch. That will almost certainly need to be updated significantly. Essentially, you'll need to make two new games that are inspired by those old ones. Maybe a more basic remaster is possible. I don't know. I don't think that headline's all that interesting compared to some other things he talked about, though. The interview he did was with Mr. Matty Plays. I have some like professional issues with that individual. I think that they're not very professional. I think that they're very lucky they've been around a long time. And the whole breaking NDA scandal with Veilguard, I don't think we ever got the full truth about that. This is all speculation, of course. And I just, I don't really want to advertise that person's content, but they do deserve credit for doing this interview. The thing from that interview that I thought was more interesting was, and it's hitting, some news sites now, is that he thinks that BioWare should throw Veilguard under the bus, for the next Mass Effect, to try to improve their own standing. And, the first reaction, especially to Dragon Age fans, is going to be, no, like that's awful. Why would he do that? Why would he even say that? He worked on that game. He knows everyone who worked on that game. That would be disrespectful to those people, to the franchise, and so on. But I think the logic makes sense, especially if you actually kind of read out what he said. And essentially what the intent was that you need BioWare to be successful to ever have a chance of another Dragon Age game. If kind of throwing Veilguard under the bus, in an effort to give people confidence about the next Mass Effect game, the next BioWare game, and to make that, to maybe soothe people's fears or whatever, that, BioWare can't make a game I like anymore because I didn't like the Veilguard and blah, blah, blah. I think the logic is, if throwing Veilguard under the bus makes BioWare's position better, that improves the potential for another Dragon Age game. Because if the next Mass Effect game doesn't do well, if BioWare doesn't regain some of its old standing, there's no chance of Dragon Age anyways. There's no chance of any games because there's a chance they could just be shut down, right? So I think that whole take has been interesting, and some of the reactions to it have just been very emotional and not very logical, at least in my opinion. And I think people need to think of the long-term picture. And he's even talked a lot, and he did it in his Q&A as well, about how, people, ask him questions over and over again, which is why I'm doing this video while his Q&A is still going on, because he's essentially just asking or answering the same questions over and over now. But basically, there's always a chance there could be more Dragon Age. They still own the IP, or EA does. But his issue now is basically there's no one left at the studio who he sees as someone who would, shoot for a new game. That, a lot of the people who are left are Mass Effect people from the Mass Effect team. And if you look at all the departures and people who got moved to other studios and so on and so forth, most of the lead production team and the directors of Veilguard are for the most part gone, or at least not at BioWare anymore. I moving into his Q&A, it was kind of interesting. He reiterated multiple times that the next Mass Effect is in development. This was mostly while answering questions about Dragon Age potentially coming back. And he even floated, and I would have to go back and get the exact words, but I believe he said something along the lines of, he thinks that BioWare, if it's around 10 or 20 years from now, may just be a Mass Effect studio for maybe that whole time. That the hope would be that maybe one day they could recover standing and get big enough to work on more than one project at a time, or even expand back into multiple franchises. But that's not a guarantee, because not even the next Mass Effect is a guarantee. That's me saying that, not him. I found that really interesting. I think that some of the other stuff he said, he mentioned at one point, I think it was during the interview he did, vaguely something about, Veilguard should have been canceled before it even came out. He clarified some of those thoughts, talking more about like Joplin, the game before what became Veilguard, that never actually happened. He talked a lot in his Q&A about how, when Anthem, Andromeda shipped, for what it was. Anthem was the next game up, and then it was going to be Joplin, which eventually didn't happen. And then Morrison, I believe is what he's talking about, eventually became Veilguard, and how he wishes they would have let Anthem continue to kind of simmer and be worked on, and then make a push to have this Joplin game, this Dragon Age game that was supposed to, sounds like it kind of be what happened before Veilguard. It's kind of a prequel to that game. Happened first because in theory they could have done that quicker as a smaller experience, then had Anthem come out a couple years later, and then they would move on from there. So I don't think necessarily feels like it would have been better off if Veilguard never happened, but it kind of sounds like he feels like they just should have taken a different path. One of the interesting things, and I've always been curious about this, so it was kind of neat to have him actually talk about it, was how some internal stats and all that they do show that there's only about a 50% crossover of Mass Effect and Dragon Age fans. That's actually higher than I expected, if you want me to be totally honest. He even mentioned at one point that the game that crossed over the most between Dragon Age and another EA property was Battlefield. Now, if you think about it, that's just because Battlefield has a ton of players, and a lot of them just happen to play Dragon Age as well. But it isn't Mass Effect, where at the end of the day, while the two franchises are somewhat different, they're also pretty similar. They just have different settings essentially, and it's surprising that there wasn't more crossover there. I do think it's interesting, just his general sentiment. If you check out this Q&A, which you should, I'll link it down in the description. It's you can tell there's so much more he wants to say. Talking about like his biggest regret was taking over Anthem. He wishes he would have said no, basically, and to stay with Dragon Age, and that he thinks that things may have worked out differently, or he thinks he could have just been fired. So it sounds like he wasn't too sure if that would have actually been the better decision for him or not. I think the whole thing, kind of taking all this into account, I think the reason I even feel like I have room to speak on this is because, I did basically the same thing back with the Division 2. I was a big fan of the first game, got to know a lot of devs, got into it. And then when they started making the second game, I was getting all the info, checking out the hiring listings, all the things I've been doing for Mass Effect for the last few years. And so I have experience doing this and kind of, reading the tea leaves, or however you would want to say it. I also would argue I'm probably one of the people who's paid the closest attention to the next Mass Effect's development when it comes to hiring and articles that have been put out, rumors that have been put out, maybe a little bit of my own conversations in the background as well. Whether or not I've talked about all those, you'll never really know. But I feel like I have a good basis and a good feel for what's been going on with this next Mass Effect game and with BioWare in general. And, hearing him talk and seeing him talk about all this stuff, it's interesting because even if he doesn't come right out and say it, he doesn't come off as someone who's super concerned about BioWare when he speaks about them working on Mass Effect and at least at their near term future. He doesn't seem like skeptical that they're even going to exist for, who knows. I'm mostly just reading this. I could be completely wrong. He's not the most emotive person in the world. So maybe there's just nothing there to read. But I will say, just from all of the combined knowledge and research and just kind of experience, paying attention to all this stuff, it's always interesting hearing him talk about it, because he doesn't speak on it. At this point, he has nothing invested, right? He, as far as I can tell, has never even touched the Mass Effect game. He was purely there for Veilguard in his contractor sense. And he doesn't talk about it like someone being like, oh yeah, we'll see if that even happens. Like, he seems fairly confident. Way more so than what I've seen with a lot of other people. Even in general, some of the questions during his Q&A that were kind of doom and gloom about BioWare and EA in general, he just kind of being like, look, like, I don't think things are quite as bad as some people are portraying them to be over there. Obviously, it's not great, but that's kind of the state of the industry. People were asking him questions about, like, oh, do you think BioWare is in danger of being shut down? And he's like, well, sure. But he's like, every single studio in the game industry right now is one bad quarter away from being shut down. And my own input on that is that if EA has kept BioWare around this long with the debacle, that not even the release of Veilguard, but just the development, the last two games they put out before that, and now including Veilguard, 3 games now that, Andromeda sold okay, but then Anthem and Veilguard not selling great. BioWare's still around somehow. So it seems like there must be some plan or some intent to keep them around. Hopefully not to just shut them down in 2 or 3 years. We'll have to wait and see. It was interesting when someone talks or asked him a question. They said, what's another publisher that would be good for BioWare other than EA? This is so like almost like theory casting at that point, though, because EA is either going to keep BioWare open or shut them down. Unless something drastic changes at EA, we won't see them sell off studios, sell off assets and IP and franchises. That's just not what they do, right? But it was interesting that the first thing he said it really quickly was Microsoft. And when you see so much chatter right now going on around Microsoft and Xbox, and even though they just did their own layoffs, it was interesting that, for a veteran like him, it wasn't even a hesitation. Then he kind of mentioned that there could be some of the kind of funding sources and, China and some other places that could be decent partners because they're fairly quiet. But he says that in the face of the example in the question was Exodus. The I think it's Archetype is under Hasbro, and Hasbro's had its own issues with their game developers. And Exodus just released a picture today of that game, and we will see. That game, it doesn't look great. I'm surprised they showed that. But that is a good example. But then we have a litany of other examples, like Humanoid Origins from Casey Hudson himself, who's been dead silent for like 8 months now since they shut that studio down. Their funding dried up and they shut down. And if there was one studio started by like a legendary developer that I thought was going to make it, it was that one. Not to mention the litany of other studios that have shut down since then, including one started or at least ran by former BioWare developers as well. So it's interesting. I do suggest checking out his Q&A if you want to check out his interview he did with Mr. Matty Plays. If you can tolerate that, then feel free. It seems like there was some juicy stuff in there. But more than anything, this didn't make me worry. He talks to people at BioWare still. I'm sure he knows some of the things going on in the background, even if he's not there anymore, whether he wants to or not. I will just say that I didn't leave that interview or his Q&A being like, oh man, I wonder, things don't look too great. How much can you really read off of it? I don't know. It's all speculation. It's all guesses. But right now, that's all we have. And that may be all we have until N7 Day and beyond. So let me know what you think. Let me know how you're feeling about everything. If you watched the interview and or the Q&A, let me know if I missed anything that was important. If you want more Mass Effect news, BioWare news, gaming news, and speculation in general, consider subscribing to the channel. Hit the like button so more people see the video. Check out the links in the video description if you want ways to support what I do. If you want to see the other things I am doing, if you want to get videos like this one just a bit early, check out the YouTube membership. I think I have it as low as $1 that you can jump on there for. That's all I have for this one. So until next time.